first time I saw Ethan, he was standing in my mother's kitchen, shirt sleeves rolled up, his laughter spilling into the room like sunlight. I hated him instantly, maybe because he looked too young, too perfect, too sure of himself. Or maybe because something deep inside me recognized trouble long before my heart did. Mom had met him at her gallery. She said he was different, that he made her feel alive again after years of numbness. She was right, Ethan had that effect on people. He carried energy, that raw, magnetic pull that made rooms bend toward him. But I couldn't shake the feeling that his smile hid something darker. I was 23, just home from grad school, trying to get my life together while Mom floated in her bubble of romance. Ethan was 28, a painter who seemed to live half in dreams and half in chaos. His hands were always stained with color, his clothes with turpentine and passion. He smelled like coffee, rain, and oil paint, the kind of scent that lingered long after he left a room. I remember the first time he caught me watching him. He looked up from his canvas, his gaze sharp and steady, and for a second, I forgot how to breathe. "You stare like you're trying to understand me," he said. "Bad habit?" I muttered, walking away before he could see the flush creeping up my neck. From that night on, things shifted. Ethan began to linger. In the mornings, he'd be in the kitchen making coffee before Mom woke up. He'd offer me a cup, teasing me about how I took it like a kid. Sometimes he'd ask about my work, my life, my plans. He had this way of making you feel seen, really seen, and it was both intoxicating and terrifying. But there was a line I never planned to cross. Until that night. Mom was away for a weekend art retreat. It was supposed to be just me and the house, quiet, predictable. But then Ethan stayed behind, said he had a deadline and couldn't leave his studio. We barely spoke the first day, both pretending to be too busy. But as night fell, the silence between us started to hum like electricity. I found him in the studio around midnight, staring at a half-finished canvas. A storm of blue and gray that looked like heartbreak made visible. "Can't sleep?" I asked. He turned, his expression unreadable. "Can you?" I shook my head, stepping closer. The air smelled like paint thinner and rain. "What's it supposed to be?" I asked, nodding toward the canvas. He hesitated, then said quietly, "It was supposed to be her. But it's not," I said, studying the brushstrokes, the violent, tender chaos of it. "It looks like someone else." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Maybe it is." When he looked at me then, it wasn't the way a man looks at his girlfriend's son. It was something else, something raw and wrong and painfully human. My chest tightened, and I should have walked away. Instead, I stayed. The storm outside grew louder, thunder cracking like the sound of breaking rules. Ethan took a step forward, and so did I. Our breaths mingled, close enough to taste the guilt. His voice was barely a whisper. "Tell me to stop." I didn't. When his lips met mine, it felt like falling through every boundary I'd ever built, and somehow landing exactly where I was meant to be. We didn't sleep that night. We didn't talk much either. Just the sound of rain against glass, and two people trying to make sense of something that made no sense at all. In the morning, everything looked different. The air was thick with silence, and neither of us knew what to say. Ethan stood by the window, shirtless, his back tense, his fingers trembling slightly as he lit a cigarette. "This was a mistake," he said. "Yeah," I whispered. "I know. But we both knew we'd say it again, and we'd both be lying." The days that followed were a blur of stolen glances and unspoken truths. Mom came home, radiant and unsuspecting, humming as she unpacked her things. Ethan avoided me at first, then couldn't seem to stop finding reasons to talk to me. A brush of his hand here, a lingering look there, each moment a reminder of that night and everything it had broken. I told myself it would fade, that what happened was a moment of weakness, not something real. But when I saw the way his hands trembled when I walked into the room, I knew this wasn't over. It was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. And when it did, it wasn't gentle. Ethan started spending more time in his studio after that night, locking the door for hours, emerging only when Mom called him for dinner. He barely looked at me, And when he did, it was with the kind of haunted eyes that made my stomach twist. I tried to convince myself it was over, that what happened had burned out as fast as it started. But every time I passed that closed studio door, I could feel it, that pull, that quiet echo of something too powerful to forget. Mom noticed the tension, of course. She wasn't blind. One night, over dinner, she looked between us and said, "You two are so quiet these days. Did I miss a fight or something?" Ethan laughed it off too quickly. "Just tired," he said. I forced a smile and nodded. But under the table, my hands were shaking. That night, I couldn't sleep again. The house felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. I found myself walking to the backyard, just needing air, needing distance. The sky was clear, the moon silver and merciless. And then I saw him, Ethan, sitting on the back steps, cigarette between his fingers, staring into nothing. "You can't keep doing this," I said quietly. He didn't turn around. Doing what? Pretending nothing happened. He exhaled smoke, slow and deliberate. "It's easier that way." "For who?" Finally, he looked at me. His expression was torn, raw. "For everyone." The words should have ended it. But instead, I sat beside him, close enough to smell the smoke and the faint trace of turpentine on his skin. Neither of us spoke for a long time. The silence was full of everything we couldn't say. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I've been running my whole life," he said. "From myself. From what I want." "Then stop running," I said before I could stop myself. His hand twitched, like he almost reached for mine. But he didn't. He just whispered, "You don't know what you're asking." I did, and it terrified me. The next few days were torture. Ethan and I danced around each other like strangers pretending to forget a secret. But every glance, every brush of proximity, felt like gravity trying to pull us back together. Then one afternoon, Mom asked me to help Ethan move some of his paintings to the gallery. I didn't want to, but I couldn't say no. We loaded the canvases into the van in silence. It wasn't until we reached the gallery, with the air thick with paint and sawdust, that something cracked. He was lifting a frame when it slipped, and I reached to steady it. Our hands touched, and that was all it took. A spark sharp and undeniable. He froze. I did too. "Don't," he whispered. "I can't," I breathed. And then, against every rule that existed, we kissed. It wasn't gentle this time. It was desperate, angry, full of everything we'd been trying to bury. When it was over, we just stood there, breathing hard, our foreheads pressed together. "This can't keep happening," Ethan said, voice shaking. "Then stop me," I said. But he didn't. That night, I lay awake thinking about him, about what it meant to want someone I shouldn't, about the way the world would see it, about Mom, about guilt. But underneath it all was something worse. The feeling that, for the first time, I was finally alive. A week later, Mom announced she was thinking of moving in with Ethan. My stomach dropped. I looked at him, and he looked at me, and in that 1 second I knew we were both standing at the edge of something irreversible. I left the table before she could see my face. Ethan came to my room that night. He didn't knock, just stood in the doorway, eyes tired and glassy. "I didn't know she was going to say that," he said. "It doesn't matter," I replied. "It does." I laughed bitterly. "You think this can be fixed? You think any of this makes sense?" He stepped closer. "No," he said softly. "But that doesn't mean it wasn't real." Something inside me broke then. "Real," I whispered. "You're with my mother, Ethan." "I know." His voice cracked. "And I hate myself for it." I wanted to hate him, too. But when he reached out, when his fingers brushed mine, all that anger melted into something else, something reckless and heartbreaking. He leaned his forehead against mine, whispering, "I'm sorry. I didn't say anything. Couldn't." When he kissed me again, it felt like goodbye. The next morning, he was gone. Mom told me he'd left for a new commission in another city. No warning, no explanation. She tried to smile, but I could tell she was hurt. I wanted to tell her everything, to tear the truth open and let it bleed, but I couldn't. It would destroy her, and maybe me too. Weeks passed. The house felt emptier than ever. I went through the motions: work, sleep, repeat, but nothing filled the silence he'd left behind. Then one day a package arrived. No return address. Inside was a small painting. Just two figures, standing in the rain, facing each other but not touching. In the corner, a single line was written in his familiar scrawl: "Some storms never end." I stared at it for hours. That night, I hung the painting on my wall and sat beneath it until dawn. I thought about what it meant. Not just love, not just loss, but the terrible beauty of feeling something so wrong and so real it changes you forever. Ethan had been my mother's boyfriend, but for one brief, impossible moment he was also mine. And maybe that was the point, that love doesn't always fit the way it should. That sometimes the people who ruin us are also the ones who make us see who we really are. I never saw him again, but sometimes, when it rains, I swear I can still feel that night. The warmth of his breath, the sound of thunder, the impossible truth that we both tried to forget. And I wonder if somewhere he's standing under the same storm, thinking of me too. Years passed, but time didn't soften what happened. It only buried it under layers of ordinary life. I moved out of my mother's house, got a job teaching art at a small community college, and pretended that what happened with Ethan was something I'd outgrown, like a fever that eventually breaks. But some nights, when the world went still and the rain began to fall against my window, I could still feel it, the pull of that night, the taste of something I was never supposed to want. Mom never talked about him again. For a while, she tried to date other people, but it never stuck. There was always a distance in her eyes, a quiet hurt she never named. I think she knew something wasn't right back then, maybe not what happened, but enough to sense the fracture in her perfect picture. I lived quietly, safely, too safely. I kept my head down, told myself I was doing the right thing, being a good son, a good man. But beneath all of that goodness was a ghost. A version of me that still stood in that rain-drenched studio, trembling between desire and destruction. It wasn't until 5 years later that I saw him again. It was at an art exhibit in the city, a retrospective for emerging American painters. I almost didn't go. I told myself it was just another opening, another evening of polite conversation and cheap wine. But when I stepped into the gallery and saw the name Ethan Clark on the wall, my breath caught. He was there, standing by one of his paintings, surrounded by a small crowd. His hair was a little longer now, streaked faintly with gray at the edges, but he was still Ethan, beautiful, magnetic, self-contained. For a moment I froze. Could have left. I should have. But my legs carried me forward anyway. He didn't notice me at first. He was explaining his work to a couple of critics, talking about light, about impermanence. And then his gaze shifted and found mine across the room. Everything stopped. The noise faded. The crowd disappeared. It was just the two of us, standing there with 5 years of silence between us. His eyes widened slightly, and I could see it. The shock, the guilt, and something softer, buried deep but still alive. I walked over slowly. When I reached him, neither of us spoke. We just looked at each other like two people trying to remember how to breathe. "Hi," I finally said. He smiled faintly. "Hi." His voice hadn't changed. Low, careful, threaded with something that could still undo me. "You're doing well," I said, nodding toward the paintings. He shrugged. "Trying to." There was a long pause. He looked down, then back up at me. "You look older." "So do you." That made him laugh soft, almost sad. I suppose we both had to grow up eventually. We stood there in silence for a moment longer, until he gestured toward one of the canvases behind him. "That one," he said quietly, "was about you." I turned. The painting showed two figures on opposite sides of a glass window. One reaching out, the other standing still. Between them, a faint reflection, like one was haunting the other. I didn't say anything. Couldn't. Ethan took a slow breath. I never stopped thinking about that night, he said. I swallowed hard. Neither did I. His eyes softened. I'm sorry. For all of it. For what I did to your mother. For what I did to you. I know, I said. I forgave you a long time ago. He shook his head. You shouldn't have had to. For the first time in years, I saw the weight he carried. Not the arrogance I once hated, but the regret of a man who had finally learned the cost of his choices. We walked outside after that, away from the crowd and the noise, into the quiet of the city night. The air was cool and smelled faintly of rain. Do you ever think about what might have happened if things were different? I asked. Ethan looked up at the sky, then back at me. All the time, he said. But then I remember. If things were different, we wouldn't have been us. He paused. And as much as it hurt, I don't think I'd change it. We stood there for a long time, just listening to the city breathe. Eventually, he said, She's doing okay? Yeah, I said softly. She's happy now. She paints again. Smaller things mostly, but she smiles when she does. He nodded, relief flickering across his face. Good. She deserves that. I hesitated before asking, Did you ever tell her? He shook his head. No. Some truths only destroy. I'd already done enough of that. There was another silence, this one gentler. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope. I was going to send this, he said, handing it to me. But maybe it's better you have it now. Inside was a postcard, a print of one of his earlier paintings, the one he'd once painted over. On the back, in his familiar handwriting, it said, Sometimes we find love in the wrong place, but that doesn't make it any less real. I felt something twist inside me, that old ache returning. Not sharp like before, but tender, almost grateful. When I looked up, he was smiling faintly. Take care of yourself, Liam. You too, Ethan. And just like that, he was gone again, walking down the street, blending into the city lights until he disappeared. I stood there, holding that postcard, realizing that closure isn't something you find. It's something you make peace with. That night, when I got home, I took the old painting, the one he'd mailed me years ago, from the wall. I placed the postcard beside it. Together, they told a story. Of love that shouldn't have been, of mistakes that shaped us, of two people who met at the wrong time but still changed each other's lives forever. And maybe that was enough. Because in the end, it wasn't just about Ethan or my mother, or the night that changed everything. It was about learning that love isn't always clean, or kind, or safe. Sometimes it's a storm you survive, and sometimes it's the rain that helps you grow. When I turned off the light, I glanced one last time at the painting, the two figures in the rain. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel guilt or longing. Just peace. Maybe some storms really don't end. But sometimes, if you're lucky, you learn how to dance in them. The sea was calm that evening, the horizon melting into the kind of orange light that makes everything look like a memory. I stood on the wooden deck of my small coastal house, coffee in hand, listening to the sound of waves folding into the shore. It had been 10 years since the night that changed everything. 10 years since Ethan. People say time heals everything. I don't think that's true. Time doesn't erase the past. It just softens the edges until it stops cutting every time you touch it. After that night at the gallery, I never saw him again. There were moments I thought I caught glimpses of him. In a crowd, on a train, in the way sunlight hit a stranger's profile, but it was always someone else. Maybe that was my mind's way of keeping him alive in places I could still visit. I built a life here by the sea. I teach art at a small college nearby. My students are young, full of dreams and questions, and sometimes I see myself in their hunger to create something that matters. I try to teach them what Ethan once taught me, though I never say his name. That art isn't about perfection. It's about truth. The kind that hurts, the kind that changes you. Mom passed away 3 years ago, peacefully, in her sleep, surrounded by her canvases and the scent of paint. Before she went, she told me she was proud of me, that I'd grown into someone honest. I think she meant it in ways neither of us needed to say out loud. After the funeral, I found one of Ethan's old letters tucked inside one of her journals. She must have kept it all these years. It wasn't about love. It was about forgiveness. He'd written, "I once thought love was about possession, about holding on. But maybe love is really about letting the other person become who they need to be, even if that means you never see them again." I sat with that letter for a long time. The ink faded and edges yellowed, wondering if he ever found the peace he was searching for. Sometimes, when the sea is quiet, I paint him. Not the way he was, but the way I remember him. The curve of his smile when he was lost in thought. The streak of light that always seemed to follow him. I don't keep those paintings. I leave them by the shore at dawn. Let the tide take them. Feels right somehow, like returning something borrowed. People in town talk about me like I'm a bit of a mystery. The quiet art teacher who never married, who spends too much time staring at the ocean. They don't know that I've already lived several lifetimes inside a single night. Last month, I received a letter with no return address. Inside was a small photograph, an art studio somewhere overseas, bathed in light. And in the corner, blurred but unmistakable, was a man painting near a window. His back was turned, but I knew it was him. On the back of the photo, a single sentence was written in his hand. "Some storms find their way home." I smiled when I read it. Not because I hoped to see him again, I didn't need to, but because I finally understood. We had stopped being awound a long time ago. Now we were just a story. A story about two people who collided at the wrong time, broke something sacred, and somehow still found a way to turn that wreckage into something beautiful. The tide came in slow and steady, brushing against the rocks like a soft exhale. I walked down to the edge of the water, holding the photograph between my fingers. The sky was dimming now, the sun slipping beneath the line where sea met sky. For a long moment, I just stood there, letting the wind move through me. Then, quietly, I let the photograph go. It landed on the surface, floated for a few seconds, and then the waves carried it away, back to wherever it needed to be. As I watched it disappear, I realized something simple and profound. I no longer needed answers. I no longer needed him to come back, because he never really left. He lived in every brushstroke I made, every lesson I taught, every storm I survived. And maybe that's what love really is. Not the kind that stays, but the kind that leaves you changed. The waves reached my feet, cool and familiar, and I laughed softly to myself. Somewhere out there, maybe under the same fading light, Ethan was painting too. And that was enough. I turned back toward the house, the smell of salt still clinging to the air, and for the first time in years I felt light, free. Because after all the chaos, after all the pain, I had finally learned the simplest truth of all. Some stories don't end. They just find quieter ways to keep going.